Ladies and gentlemen, namaskar. Welcome to the 15th edition of the Jaipur Literature Festival, protected by Dettol Banega Swasth India at Jan Michalski Foundation, Better. We are delighted to introduce Shantiniketan. The session is presented by Dainik Bhaskar. The blue of twilight spread across the horizon. Murmurs ring sweet and calm across the orchard of the Saal. It is difficult for the heart that has known Tagore's sanctuary to forego the poetry of Shantiniketan. The late literary figure and social activist, Mahasweta Devi, captured fascinating vignettes of her day as a schoolgirl in Shantiniketan, home to the school, university, and harmony founded by Tagore. And her entire ethos, as shaped by these reminiscences in the book, are Shantiniketan. Writer, critic, and translator Radha Chakravarty is the genius behind the English translation of Devi's nostalgic journey to Shantiniketan, where dreams are cradled by the sky, and has translated the pioneering Bengali writers in the name of the mother. She has also co-edited the anthology, The Essential Tagore, and translated some of Tagore's most important works. In conversation with academic and writer Reba Som, Chakravarty discusses the early experiences of the brilliant Mahasweta Devi in a remarkable environment of coexistence, creativity, and culture.
Good afternoon. It's really a pleasure to be back at the JLF after our lives had been held hostage to a virus for 2 years. It's also lovely to be in conversation with Radha Chakravarty on her latest translation of Mahasweta Devi's memoir, Our Shantiniketan. In fact, I love the cover of the book with splashes of green foliage inspired by the painting of famous Shantiniketan artist K.G. Subramania. It's so evocative of the Shantiniketan that Mahasweta Devi had cherished. I do wish, though, that the page numbers were included in the narrative in the contents, which would make for easier reading. This is not a straightforward memoir. In fact, it's snatches of conversation recorded by the editor of Srishti Prakashan, the publishing house which brought out the book. And in her reminiscences made when she was 75 years old, Mahasweta Devi often struggles with her power of recall. Rather, you write that Mahasweta Devi creates the image of an unreliable narrator. Would you instead say that she presents a faithful recall of the spirit of Shantiniketan, imbued with Tagore's values?
Thank you for this very probing question, Reba Di, because when we read a memoir, I think it's different from reading fiction, where we know it's a world of make-believe. A memoir makes certain truth claims. And in effect, when we pick up a memoir, we expect that the writer will tell us the truth about her life. But this is an unusual memoir where the writer confesses to a failing memory lapses, and struggles with the whole process of recall, and where she continuously interrupts her own narrative with self-questioning, saying, I think this is the name of the person, but maybe I'm wrong. I think this is the place we went to, or that was the year when a book was published. Did I get it right? I'm not sure. So there are these open confessions to uncertainty which destabilize the narrative and make this a very evocative human journey into the past, where we see enacted in the pages her memories of a bygone Shantiniketan, a lost world for which she harbors a deep nostalgia. But at the same time, we see the internal psychological drama of an aging writer struggling with her own dementia, her own failing memory. And I think that drama, as it plays out in the pages, is what makes the book so emotionally intense dense and so very interesting and fascinating to read. And at the same time, this is not just a personal narrative, but it's also, as Reba is saying, a text that, even while it makes lapses about forgetting facts, I think what we see evoked here is the spirit of the entire ethos of Shantiniketan as it was in the 1930s when Mahasweta Devi first went there as a little child of 10, and she was there from the years 1936 to 1938. And at that time, in the living presence of Tagore, what she experienced and what she treasures in her heart is what she talks about. So the spirit that she brings alive, I think that is what Reba is talking about. But at the same time, I'll just read a little bit from the end of the first chapter when we see the way in which she thinks about the treasured memory of Shantiniketan. She talks about how the Shantiniketan I saw when I went there at the age of 10, that is what remains etched in my memory as our Shantiniketan. Like a dazzling feather that has fluttered down from some unknown place. In my mind, it remains, enclosed within a box made of glass. I can turn it this way or that, look at it from any angle, whenever I desire. I can. It's something I can do even now. Still, I have traveled a long distance away from my childhood, so the glass box now seems far, far away. I gaze at it and realize that the colors are fading. I realize that one day, all the colors will vanish. Of course they will vanish. Someday, someone will ask me to write about it, and with my dimming vision, I will sit down to write. 64 years now. How long will the feather keep its colors waiting? The feather stands for memories of childhood. Memories don't wait either. Memories grow tired. They want to go to sleep.
Tagore's school that he founded in Shantiniketan in 1901 was called the Ashram, with 5 students, which included his son Rotindranath. And it was modeled on the conventional education of classical India, the Tapovan concept in Kalidasa, where students were taught in the natural environment under trees. Since all of Tagore's wisdom and learning was self-realized, he sought to create an atmosphere where he could take on the role of an unconventional teacher, allowing students freedom to explore their environment, discover themselves. They could walk bare feet to feel the dust under their soles, and climb trees to get the feel of the bark and the foliage. Mahasweta Devi studied in Shantiniketan in 2 phases, one from 1936 to 1938, when she was in close proximity of Tagore, and again for her graduate studies from 1944 to 46, when Tagore had already passed away. She seems to have totally internalized the spirit of education that Tagore had envisioned. And she writes, and I quote from your book, "Studying in Patobhavan in Shantiniketan, it was inevitable that our minds should absorb the awareness that the entire world and universe could be found there in a single nest." Perhaps you'd like to elaborate.
Yes, indeed. I think what the book tells us in its own way, through a whimsical, anecdotal narrative, but in vivid detail, which brings that whole world alive, we can see how Tagore's vision is something that was suffused through the entire atmosphere of Shantiniketan itself. And this whole idea of the world in one nest, we all know that that is the motto of the Vishwabharati University that Tagore founded. And it's very interesting how Tagore founded this university in the heart of rural Bengal, not in the metropolis, and he brought the world into that nest in the heart of nature. And he expressed through his practices and his example and through the institutions that he created a very, very inclusive and heterogeneous vision of including elements from different cultures, from different parts of the world. Students came from everywhere to study in Shantiniketan. The teachers came from everywhere. People spoke different languages. And yet, there was this feeling that there was a common place, a common space where all of them could bond and connect together. And this idea of Shantiniketan as a microcosm of the world and of that entire world as a microcosm of the universe. I think that is the spirit that Shantiniketan evoked in the heart of Mahasweta Devi, and I think it is something that she retained in her heart forever, because we see in her writing this urge to express her respect for all living things, be they ever so humble.
In a candid admission, in an essay Tagore himself wrote, I cannot deceive myself that the Bishwabharati as an institution will survive meaningfully for ages. However, he was confident that it would have a lasting impact on students. Addressing students on the 4th of August 1938, and I imagine Mahasweta Devi would be in this student audience, Tagore said, and I quote here, I remember being told by people whose judgment one may rely upon, that our students had a stamp of idealism owing to this kind of training. Even the casual outsiders could see and feel it. The students were always in readiness to help others, always cheerful and equipped with real human interest, in which, as a rule, our people are lacking. Mahasweta Devi confirms Tagore's views when she says that the lasting influences of Tagore can be seen or noticed by discerning people and required more analysis. She mentions two main contributions of Tagore on her social awareness. The first was co-education, right from infancy, and the second major contribution of Shantiniketan education was that students were made to feel that they were Indians first, with no provincial narrowness entering their minds. And both of these, she says, were of immeasurable importance.
Yes, I think these 2 points that you raise as Tagore's special contributions are very visible in the experiences narrated by Mahasweta in her memoirs, because we see, for instance, how Shantiniketan opened its doors to girl students, and the kind of freedom of intellect and the kind of physical freedom that they enjoyed there. We see the images of girls indulging in the rough and tumble of student life, playing games, jumping into the river, climbing trees, communing with nature. And we see also their access to the life of the intellect without any restrictions, and the inculcation of a questioning spirit, of a curious mind, all opening the eyes of their minds, as Mahasweta tells us. So we can see how visionary Tagore was in his approach to education, in the way he introduced co-education in Shantiniketan, and that influence lasted for a long time. I mean, it was a lifelong influence on Mahasweta Devi. It's also seen through the narrative how girls, along with boys, performed songs and dances, took part in public events and performances, and they had access to the public domain through these. So we can see through the personal experiences of Mahasweta, Tagore's vision expressed an entire ethos depicted in this text. Regarding the second aspect that you talked about, which is that of rising above a kind of narrow provincialism. As I said, students came from everywhere to Shantiniketan, bringing their own cultural backgrounds with them, the teachers as well. And we see a mingling of cultures, a mingling of sensibilities encouraged at Shantiniketan. There are whole chapters in the book about the personages at Shantiniketan and the kind of different kinds of background and intellect that they brought and the kind of creative practices they introduced there. But I would also say here that the students were encouraged not only to think beyond the narrow borders of Bengal and to think of themselves as part of a larger terrain called India, but there is also Tagore's internationalism very visible in the way he imagined Shantiniketan, because we are told about the Japanese art that was displayed, and it was one of the first things the child Mahasweta saw when she entered the place. We are told about China Bhavan being built. It's very interesting that Tagore thought of building China Bhavan in the heart of Shantiniketan decades before we today are waking up and saying we ought to know our big neighbor better. He opened Hindi Bhavan and promoted the teaching of Hindi decades ago. So this kind of eclecticism is something that the book gestures at through the personal experiences and anecdotes that are given there.
Yeah, and also the international professors and teachers, the faculty came and enriched the experience of the students. In 1915, Gandhiji visited Shantiniketan and made a novel suggestion that one day in the year, the staff should be given off, and the teachers and students should undertake some of the cooking and also menial tasks like cleaning of toilets. Now, this is a practice which is continued in Shantiniketan on the 10th of March, and Mahasweta writes how she was part of this team to clean toilets. She also mentions that all students, irrespective of their economic background, had to follow the same school discipline. Now, Shantiniketan lay in the vicinity of many villages, and these were Shauntal villages, tribal villages. And during their annual festival, which is Posh Mela, she recalls how the Shauntal women would come with their handmade jewelry, and bowls would regale them with their songs. And she writes that it was a mela close to the soil. Now, this education of Mahasweta in her formative years really laid the foundation of her socialist thinking. And wouldn't you agree, Radha, that this experience awakened her interest in Adivasi life, about which she was to write copiously later?
Yes, I think Mahasweta, when she talks about the formative influence of Shantiniketan, it's certainly true that her activism, the passionate espousal of the cause of the marginalized, the lifelong struggle for those less privileged than herself, I think all this stemmed from the social awareness that was awakened, the social conscience that was awakened at a very early age in her heart when she was a young child at Shantiniketan. And it is precisely through her exposure to these practices, these egalitarian practices, and the emphasis on work, which she keeps talking about in the book. The emphasis on laboring tirelessly, because the importance of effort and pursuing one's goals tirelessly, I think these are some of the habits that remained with her all her life. And regarding the Adivasis as well, she talks about the Mela, with a great deal of excitement, and she brings alive the color and the festivity, the festive atmosphere there. She even talks about how someone offered to buy her something she really wanted, and she asked for a tin of Nestle's condensed milk because that was supposed to be a real treasure. So, she has these very vivid memories through which she evokes this sense of the presence of people who later she would support very closely. And through the exposure to this kind of life, she also, I think, acquired a sense of the equality of all beings, not just human beings. And in fact, in a witty part of the book, in a witty anecdote, she talks about animals at Shantiniketan, and she says, yes, there were swans, there were peacocks, but the animal I really love is the donkey. And she says, not for swans or peacocks, but for donkeys I have long harbored a profound tenderness. Have any of you seen baby donkeys covered in long fur? How innocent and beautiful they look. Looking at them, you can't tell that they will grow up to be beasts of burden. symbols of mute labor. So you can see how she's, writing figuratively as an older woman, looking back at her childhood love for donkeys, because as she grows older, they come to symbolize for her something much more than just a species of animal life.
Mahasweta wrote that her student years in Shantiniketan were spent in the lap of nature, amidst a cycle of seasons which were celebrated with festivals. And she says, and I quote here, "My most miraculous discovery was the infinite beauty and distinctive aesthetic sensibility manifest in everything in Shantiniketan. Her deep regret was that the agency of humans was spoiling the balance of nature, and with great foresight, she wrote that nature was waiting like a coiled snake and would strike back." And would you like to discuss how these ecological concerns are evident in some of her writings?
Yes, in fact, now there is a lot of attention being paid to the ecological concerns in Mahasweta Devi's work. They have always been there, but perhaps her struggle for human rights has, overshadowed some of these other important concerns. But the question of the Anthropocene, the question of an endangered planet, an endangered ecology, are very, very prominent in her work. And I think this again was inculcated through the kind of teaching environment, learning environment at Shantiniketan, outdoor classes where she was absorbing her lessons, but also watching the squirrels and ants at work and imbibing a parallel set of lessons from them. And this whole exposure to the natural beauty around Shantiniketan, I think all of this and an awareness of the season through the various seasons, through the various festivals, all of this embedded in her heart, this awareness, this ecological awareness of the interconnectedness of the lives of all species and of the life of the planet. And we see in this text entire chapters devoted to the flora and fauna of Shantiniketan, to the fruits, the flowers, the animals, the birds, even the snakes at Shantiniketan. Yes, I love that bit too, because I think somebody says in the nature studies class, one student says, because the teacher is saying you must love all animals, and the student says, but I don't like snakes. I find it very hard to like snakes. And what the teacher does is to take the child and make the child put her hand in the hollow of a tree, and what comes out is a wriggling bundle of baby snakes, and they're harmless, and they slide off into the grass, and that's how the child gets over her aversion to snakes. So this is how the book creates an ecological awareness without being heavy-handed about it. We see this early consciousness reflected in Mahasweta's later work in very well-known stories like The Hunt or Salt or Pterodactyl, which is really about an endangered planet. So we see this concern in her activism, in her writings, and definitely it's something that was bred in her very early through her experiences at Shantiniketan.
In his essay, The Schoolmaster, Tagore had written, and I quote here, "Our system of education refuses to admit that children are children. Children are punished because they fail to behave like grown-up people and have the impertinence to be noisily childish. I adopted the system of freedom cure, if I can give it that name. The boys were allowed to run about, to climb difficult trees, and would often come to grief in their falls. They would often get drenched in the rain, or they would swim in the pond." And Mahasweta recalls some of her most fun moments in school were when she got drenched in the Kopai River with her friends. So why don't you share some of these experiences?
In fact, this episode is part of one of the loveliest passages in the book, where she talks about how the festivals at Shantiniketan are in tune with the seasons and celebrate the change of seasons, even as they bring out a kind of ecological awareness. For instance, there is the Brikharopan festival, which is the tree planting ceremony. Then they have the Holokorshan, or the plowing festival, where the students participate in these agricultural activities and develop a sense of responsibility towards nature. And in this atmosphere, the way she describes the arrival of the monsoon is truly wonderful. She says, the leaves on the trees wilted, and by 10 in the morning, the sun grew blazing hot. And then came a deep rumbling, followed by an endless succession of dark clouds. We got to witness the monsoon come rushing in, filling the horizon, torrents of rain rushing towards us like an army of soldiers brandishing their spears. And after that first shower, the fragrance of damp earth filling the heart with solace. As soon as the downpour began, a tide of red water descended on the Kopai. And the master moshais would rush to the river, drag us into the water, and remain with us to ensure that we did not drown. Donning the damp clothes left on the river shore, letting the garments dry out on our bodies, that was how Shantiniketan could mold our physique to make it as resilient as the earth.
As an aside, I would like to mention that I studied in a school in Kolkata where almost all our teachers were from Shantiniketan. And on a school outing, I remember being taken there, and it so happened that it was pouring torrents of rain, and our teacher promptly said that all of you just go out and get drenched. And so we all trooped out, and there were some mangoes which had fallen, raw mangoes, which we were asked to collect and then cut and then nibble with salt. And we all loved it. But my mother was aghast when I recounted this because she thought that I would have caught a chill. So I remember this so much. One of the most abiding influences of Shantiniketan on Mahasweta was Rabindra Sangeet. And she writes, and I quote from your book, in Shantiniketan, vast waves of song seem to constantly heave and swell. And this is something, she says, that we listened to and absorbed the music.
Yes, in fact, she devotes many pages of the book to music. We hear about music throughout the book. How early in the morning they get up and go out and sing. How at every festival they sing. When it rains, they sing. When it's autumn, they sing. So music, she says, suffuses the place. The place is steeped in music. So apart from formal music lessons or rehearsals for performances, music is in the atmosphere of Shantiniketan. And I'll read a part of the book where she talks about these things. Our day began with song. Rushing outdoors to get drenched in the rain, you sang. You sang at Barsha Mongol and at Bashantotshav. There were no fixed hours for singing. One listened and one sang. And between song and season, what extraordinary harmony. Even today, if one hears the songs Choitro Pabone or Shukno Pata Ke Jharai, it is the warm month of Choitro in Shantiniketan that one remembers. As I have recounted, we felt the change of seasons in our hearts. My memories of music remain intertwined with that experience. Shantiniketan taught one to drink in the elements of life and nature with all one's senses, as if one were dying of thirst. That was the soul of the music. After leaving Shantiniketan, year after year, I have sung song after song for everyone. If you knew how to sing, you sang spontaneously from the heart. It was not the ashram that taught us to sing after all. Listening to the music, we found our voices awakening to song. At Sangeet Bhavan, there was a blind boy named Kalu. When he sang, we used to listen entranced. Where has that music vanished now? Those days, truly talented musicians didn't need books or notebooks when they sang. They had the esraj for accompaniment. And this practice of singing without the help of written lyrics, it entered one's very bloodstream. I don't know if this is true of most singers of our time, but even an amateur singer, like me, can still sing from memory, drawing on a repertoire of several hundred songs, when I find listeners in a different place. Ours was the era of full-throated song. singing at the top of our voices, pouring everything we had, our health, our inner energy, our all into the joy of singing. After the age of 12, I no longer lived in Shantiniketan, but I had carried the music with me. I used to sing for Ma, and at the ashram, the practice continued of ceremonially welcoming each new day with song.
I think this is the evocative aspect of Rabindra Sangeet, that all of us who have learnt it from childhood, in my case, it's so intrinsic to us that even in later years, whenever you are in a particular mood, it seems Tagore had written a song just for you. And this is why to many Bengalis, Rabindra Sangeet is like a personal religion. You just have to dip into it and you would get an answer to whatever your problems of the day. Mahasweta Devi took great pride in recalling that she'd seen the legendary Rabindranath at close quarters. Just imagine, she exults in this book. Young students had liberal access to visit the poet in his house and get autographs signed. She mentions with deep regret that the poet's autographed copies of 2 short poems that he had written for her unfortunately got lost. I must confess I had a similar experience because Mahasweta Devi visited us in our home in Rome, Italy. And after a lovely session of Rabindra Sangeet in which she heartily joined in, she wrote a poem for me in my autograph book, which sadly I've misplaced. Tagore had written in his essay, My School, and I quote, "I believe that the object of education is the freedom of mind, which can only be achieved through the path of freedom." And this was the spirit of Mahasweta Devi, which she imbibed in Shantiniketan. She writes, "Whatever you do, do it on your own. Become independent in your thoughts and deeds." And Radha, would you like to speak a little more about this fiercely free spirit of Mahasweta that found expression in her literary works?
Yes, Mahasweta, I think, is best known as the fiery and passionate activist who dedicated her life to those less fortunate than herself. And both in her activism and in her writings, we see this concern practiced in such a way that she saw these 2 sides of her life as a seamless whole, and she said that there was a continuity between the two. She also not only wrote about the underprivileged, but she gave them voice through the journal she edited called Bortika, where members of the tribal groups could actually write in their own voices. So she actually practiced what she preached throughout her life. Her life became an example of these activities. But we also, I think, need to note that in our Shantiniketan, a different Mahasweta also emerges. She has been focusing on the narrative, and we have been talking about how it molded her future activities. But she reveals in this book a side of herself that she fiercely hides from view, and she shields from view behind this exterior of the tough, hardened activist whom no one can melt. What we see in this text is an emotional Mahasweta, a vulnerable Mahasweta, a Mahasweta struggling with a failing memory, a Mahasweta who is moved by nostalgia. And this is the other side of a text where we see nostalgia becoming an occasion for a sharp critique of the present and how it has fallen away from Tagore's ideals. But we see we see in this text another Mahasweta speaking in a voice that we are unaccustomed to hearing, and it kind of humanizes the figure for us. And part of the challenge of translating this book was to capture this double Mahasweta, or more than double. I think she had several faces, and some of that emerges in the layerings of this narrative.
Would you like to say a few words about how you went about translating this? Maybe a little bit, because you are so well known as a translator. But this particular book with snatches of memories and conversations, maybe just a little bit you can say?
Yes, I think this book, I would like to say at the end of everything we have said about Rabindranath and Mahasweta, I would like to say as the book's translator that it's my book too. And I would like to say that perhaps this book needs to be read as a double-voiced book, because when you translate, something of yourself goes into the text. I don't think a literary translation really works unless there is a kind of intimacy between the translator and the work being translated. And I think what happens is that you hear the voice of Mahasweta, but inevitably, because translation is not a transparent medium, I think somewhere my relationship with the book comes through too, with the original text comes through too. So translation is this very difficult process of moving a text from one language to another, one culture to another, and you face innumerable challenges here. My challenge in this book, for instance, one of the many challenges I faced was that this is a book that looks backward to the past, and it's a book that at the same time needs to be translated for contemporary readers in a modern contemporary idiom, to bring that past to life in the way the original has done. And to do that, I found I had to retain a lot of the Bengali terms for which perhaps one could have struggled to find equivalents, but it would have actually diluted the cultural specificity of the translation, the particularities of the text, the atmosphere that is woven in the text. I think the language is part of the very fabric of that text. And the strategy one found, which I don't deploy normally in my other translations, but this one is so full of references that I added a translator's note at the end where one has provided more details of the flora, fauna, personages, events, and other aspects of Shantiniketan that are referred to, or the relationship and kinship terms, names of food items, etc., where I have retained the Bengali. But for those who want to go beyond the flavor of the Bengali to know more about the actual meanings, I allowed the text, the translated text, to hold certain mysteries for the reader, for the non-Bengali reader, but provided something at the end of the book as a kind of frame to which readers could respond.
I must say that when I read the book, I did not think that her fading memory in any way stands in the way of appreciating the book, because she really captures very faithfully what she felt and she sensed in Shantiniketan. So there's no mistake over there at all. Recalling names and so on, as I also realized at my age, is something that happens. But it wasn't really a serious error. I think she was a bit diffident when she had this recording. I think we're coming to the end of our session, but I remember Sanjoy telling me something about singing, but I must beg to be excused because I think it's the heat and the cold, etc. It's taken a toll on my voice. However, I'd like to share a little anecdote. When Mahasweta Devi came, and she came, as I said, visited us in Rome, I went to see her famous, the film, Hazar Chaurasi Ki Maa, which is based on her novel, with her. So there she was sitting by my side. Now, I was in Kolkata in Presidency College when the entire Nakshal period happened, and we saw a lot of student unrest. A lot of brilliant students of Presidency College were rounded up, and they were arrested, and God knows what else happened to them. But we as students felt they were a bit of a nuisance because they were holding up exams and we were getting delayed. But when I saw this film with her, and I came back, because it's really about student politics and how students really were vulnerable to this and victimized for this, I came back with a tinge of regret and a lot of empathy. And this is what is the mark of a very successful writer, that she can actually project the other side of the story so brilliantly. And that is what Mahasweta Devi was all about. I think we have time for the questions. You don't give up, do you?
Good afternoon. That was an amazing session, Radhika Di and Reba Di. And you said very rightly that Tagore's songs are so profound, everybody could connect to them as if they are written for us only. My favorite being Aji Jhore, Raten Hriday Amar Prakash Holo. My two questions to Reba Di, that we could draw a lot of parallels between Gandhi and Tagore. Because Gandhi's and Tagore's, both their idea of nationalism was very different. There was blurring of boundaries. Whole world is a family. And his beautiful idea, Shantiniketan, was a beautiful representation of his idea of, that thing. So what are your views on Tagore's idea of a nation, nationhood? And my second question is, you again said that Tagore was he was not very happy with the present education system. And same goes with Gandhi as well, that he also was big about, arts and crafts and all the handicraft work that he stressed upon. So what are your views on Tagore's idea of nationhood, and what are your views on Tagore's ideas of education? These are my two questions. Thank you so much.
They're both very loaded questions, because this was at the time of the British rule. And Tagore, of course, caused a lot of controversy with his nationalism lectures, which he delivered in many countries, in Japan and the United States. But basically what he meant is he was against nation as a mechanical sort of institution where you're not allowed to grow and there is no diversity, no plurality. That aspect of nation he did not like. But in the period of nationalism, a lot of people found a problem with this because you were supposed to be nationalistic. For him, this concept did not clash with his innate patriotism. So there's been a lot of debate and dialogue about Tagore and his concept of nationhood and nationalism. He was patriotic to the core, but he was not willing to take the Western model of nationhood. So that is one question. And of course, thoughts on education, Shantiniketan is the living proof. But he also said that, he doesn't expect the Vishwabharati experiment to, to be there forever. And I'm sad to say, in my last visit to Shantiniketan, exactly 2 years ago, I found there was something very missing. But what remains alive of this spirit is in people who have been trained in Shantiniketan, who have imbibed some of it through his works, through his music, through his aesthetic values. And you can immediately see what is called a Rabindrik style in the way you dress, in the way you conduct yourself, in the way you think. And that is something which I think stays on. Any further questions? Why don't you join me? Amar to gola geche bhenge. Pinak.
Can I go ahead?
আগুনের পরশমণি ছোঁয়াও প্রাণে এ জীবন পূর্ণ করো এ জীবন পূর্ণ করো এ জীবন পূর্ণ করো এ জীবন পূর্ণ করো দহন দানে এ আগুনের পরশমণি ছোঁয়াও প্রাণে. I think we have to invoke আগুনের পরশমণি, all of us.
Ma'am? One small question. Coming from a background of international schools, when I hear liberal education like Shantiniketan, why is it not being promoted in Indian education right now? I mean, it's totally liberal and you can see that how much you'll end up learning much more than the education, and it's much better. Why is it not being promoted anymore?
I have just a quick answer to that. When, for example, Radha also spoke about co-education, can you imagine what a tremendous revolutionary decision that was for Tagore. For women from good, respectable families, they came actually to stay, to be educated with boys. That was a huge step. Now, of course, that whole thing has changed a lot. And yet, there remain gaps. And as an educationist, perhaps you'd like to add something.
Actually, Mahasweta Devi herself talks about how Shantiniketan itself has fallen away from Tagore's ideals. And at the end of the book, she speaks of her own dream for Shantiniketan, a dream university that Shantiniketan could have become, and that it still can become. And she says, I still cherish that in my heart. And much of the dream that she outlines, for lack of time, I won't talk about it in detail, but it draws upon precisely Tagore's ideals. So I think what you are voicing here is very much also what Mahasweta Devi felt, and I think that was one of the things that prompted her to write this book. The feeling that somewhere the visionary element perhaps has gone missing through the mechanics of teaching in an institutionalized way. And she says that Shantiniketan has grown up now. Well, that had to happen, as if Shantiniketan in its infancy was the kind of idyll that she treasures in her heart. So the sentiment you're voicing here is perhaps something that is at the core of Mahasweta Devi's book. And I think perhaps revisiting Tagore's ideals would be great for educational institutions, not just here, but across the world.
Thank you, Radha Chakravarty and Reba Som, for this sublime session, Shantiniketan.